Good afternoon. I am Dita Amory, curator in charge of the Robert Lehman collection here at the Met and curator of our Finnish exhibition, Seeing Silence, the paintings of Helene Schjerfbeck. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our long-standing series, Sunday at the Met. Today, it seems especially fitting to celebrate a woman as we mark Women's History Month nationwide, and today is actually International Women's Day. I will give you an introduction to the artist's life and work. My esteemed Met colleague, conservator Charlotte Hale, will introduce Schjerfbeck's highly individualistic painting process by way of the Met's picture recently acquired, The Lace Shawl. And Patricia Berman, a widely recognized scholar of Nordic art, will enlighten us on the mysteries of tapestry, a painting whose narrative still confounds us a century later. I am so grateful to Charlotte and to Pat for their thoughtful catalog essays and for their unwavering support throughout the organization of the exhibition. By way of introduction, Charlotte Hale is the Sherman Fairchild Conservator in charge of paintings conservation. She received her conservation training at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and joined the staff here at the Met in 1987. Charlotte has worked on paintings spanning the collection of the museum, but specializes in 19th century European paintings. Recent conservation treatments include paintings by Daumier, Monet, and Seurat. She has published and lectured widely on painting techniques and materials, including a co-authored monograph on Bellini's St. Francis in the Desert at the Frick. Her most recent publications are technical studies of paintings by Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, Seurat, and now Schjerfbeck, all for shows at the Met. Patricia Berman is the Theodora L. and Stanley H. Feldman Professor of Art at Wellesley College, where she teaches courses in modern and contemporary art, the history of photography, and propaganda studies. She also taught for 5 years at the University of Oslo and facilitated research for the exhibition Munch, Modernism and Modernity. Publishing widely in journals, anthologies, and exhibition catalogs, she has authored books on Edvard Munch, James Ensor, and 19th century Danish painting. Her exhibitions in the US, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, and Turkey include as their subjects Edvard Munch's photography, Andy Warhol and Munch's printmaking, gestural drawing, and Munch and Women. Pat's co-curated exhibition entitled The Scandinavian Home, Art and Identity, 1880 to 1920, is traveling in the US through 2027. Organizing Helene Schjerfbeck's exhibition has truly been a gift for me. My appreciation of her art and life has grown every day as we mine her paintings in conversation with visitors. I could never have imagined her powerful handling of light, for example, light that focuses the eye on arthritic hands, or the subtle placement of scissors dangling from a rocking chair. I never would have understood the full measure of Schjerfbeck's brave, radical shifts from prescriptive conservatism to a wholly original modernism, were it not for the highly selective paintings that line our walls. Every exhibition is full of revelations, but this one has deepened my admiration for a woman who never gave up, who endured personal and geopolitical challenges all her life. She painted for nearly 80 years. Painting held her together, rescued her from nervous breakdowns, stirred her mind, and gave her hope to carry on. She was drawing at 4 years old while convalescing from a fall. By the age of 11, she was a student in the drawing school of the Finnish Art Society, and at 18, she was on her way to Paris to train in the now legendary art academies. There is nothing youthful about Schjerfbeck's early paintings. While they emerge from an entrenched tradition of naturalism, they are painted consistently with a confident hand that belie their maker's young age. Toward the end of the 19th century, when oppressive Russian rule was still in force in Finland, there was a growing cultural groundswell to define Finnish identity. It was incumbent on artists to paint romanticized imagery drawn from Finland's history and literature. Schjerfbeck launched her career with the death of William von Schwerin, a young Finnish count who lost his life in the war fought against Sweden for Russian rule. Schjerfbeck learned of this narrative from a Finnish-Swedish narrative poem. She painted the subject iteratively, and the first of these variants won her a grant to study in Paris, stipends that were renewed year after year. In Paris, she was joined by a handful of Finnish female artists who called themselves the Painter Sisters. They were also self-styled as Sisters of the Brush. Although Schjerfbeck would not have a gallery representing her for nearly another 30 years, she exhibited with frequency right through her life. And in 1883, she was invited to participate in the annual Paris Salon. She submitted a large-scale painting honoring the autumn festival of Sukkot, which commemorated the exodus of Jews from Egypt. After years of study and travel on the continent and in the UK, Schjerfbeck returned to Helsinki in 1892 to teach at the Finnish Art Society's drawing school. She later trained students in the painting studio. It is said that she mentored many young artists who would go on to illustrious careers, and yet her students never really knew her. She always kept her distance and resisted answering questions. She demanded absolute silence in the classroom and moved about quietly. This is no surprise. Schjerfbeck was very private, preferring to express herself on canvas and in the many letters she wrote to friends. It's in writing that she shared her innermost thoughts. In one letter, she writes of her struggles, quote, "No artist has accomplished in any given day what they had hoped for when they woke up that morning. Each day deals a heavy blow. How can one tolerate the disappointment year after year? That struggle has taught me to love loneliness," end quote. And in another letter, "Mostly I just sit by myself. I feel lonely sometimes, and yet life feels pleasant. I don't care for company. The work keeps me upright, and the rest renews me from all the thinking," end quote. I should mention that along with her admitted loneliness, Schjerfbeck suffered neurasthenia, an arcane word to describe depression, a condition that challenged her well-being and interrupted her painting right through life. It's remarkable that she had the tenacity and resilience to continue painting when her emotional circumstances often mitigated against it. In 1902, Schjerfbeck resigned her teaching position and moved with her mother to Hyvinkää, a small railroad town 57 kilometers northwest of Helsinki. It was customary practice in Finland to care for a widowed parent, and Schjerfbeck could survive on support from her mother's modest widow's pension. Their accommodations were Spartan and without climate control. Helene slept and worked in the only bedroom, and her mother lived in the kitchen. Winters were brutally cold, while summers were often unbearably hot. Helene would actually find a certain peace in Hyvinkää, removed from the critical eye of Helsinki and free to paint all day. It was in Hyvinkää that she largely evolved her own formal language. Working primarily in figuration, she often posed her mother and local residents in quiet interiors where her brushwork veered from simplified naturalism to evocative abstraction. As you can imagine, a railroad town with a woolen mill and sanatorium had no professional models. Shopkeepers, neighbors, and Olga Schjerfbeck posed for these charming pictures. It is said that Olga Schjerfbeck had little appreciation of her daughter's paintings, And yet, as a captive candidate, she modeled repeatedly, reading or sewing for canvases manifesting a new aesthetic. In My Mother, Mother Reading, Schjerfbeck has stripped away vestiges of her early training, streamlining color and form in spare, unmodulated passages, all to foreground the sitter in profile. She shines a light on her subject, but offers no individuality, no persona. As the artist explained, quote, "We do not need to enumerate all the details. It is by mere hint that we approach the truth." In another picture where Olga modeled, marvelous light defines her receding hairline and arthritic hands as she struggles to sew a garment. Silence prevails once again. Olga is lost in thought, seemingly unaware of her daughter's easel. It is the quietude, or better said, disquiet, that Schjerfbeck imparts. She asked her subjects to sit quietly as she embarked on every picture. Once underway, she then told them to leave, preferring to rely on imagination and memory. These mature paintings abandon the tight brushwork of her Paris training. Freely brushed and freed of props, they collectively introduce an atmosphere of silence, isolation, and interiority. In 1907, a young neighbor, Anna Lintomaki, sat for a painting simply titled Silence. The bus-length study is one of few one might call a portrait. Predictably, there's no contact between the sitter and painter. Anna averts her eyes, staring downward, her presence bathed in a soft light. Anna Lintomaki sat with her sister Irene for girls' reading. Here, various drawing media, watercolor, gouache, and pencil combine on paper to realize a matte surface. The self-engaged young women resemble mannequins, remote and lifeless, and yet highly affecting. Once again, it is raking light that animates the protagonists. You will note the teaser on the wall, Holbein's portrait of Erasmus. On the eve of World War I, Schjerfbeck embarked on The Tapestry, a picture that carried her earlier Hyvinka investigations to another level of abstraction and modernity. Two ethereal figures appear to float in space against a flat background and an elevated ocean horizon line, recalling elements of Japanism. The image has a disquieting quality, its narrative eluding us all. There's some speculation that the painting was preliminary to a tapestry or that the figures are standing in front of a tapestry. We know that Schjerfbeck designed tapestries at a moment in time, but there's no definitive explanation to account for this mesmerizing picture. You will hear a great deal more on the subject from Pat Berman. Despite living a quiet life in Hyvinka, caring for her ever-enfeebled mother, Schjerfbeck's visibility was growing. The art dealer Gösta Stenman discovered her work in an exhibition at a museum in Helsinki and immediately bought Girls' Reading, which you have just seen. After opening an art gallery in Helsinki, he tracked down Schjerfbeck in Hyvinka, paid her a visit, and left with 12 newly finished paintings. From that moment forward, he engineered her sales and became her devoted advisor. Helena was uncomfortable with her growing fame and rising market value. She only wanted enough cash to manage her practice. Her treasured privacy was fast disappearing. It was Gösta Stenman who introduced Schjerfbeck to literature, books and periodicals, describing contemporary trends in art, above all in Paris. He even took paintings to Hyvinka, works he was selling by Picasso, Juan Gris, Marie Laurencin, and others. While the isolation of life in a remote town had its advantages for a painter, especially one of Schjerfbeck's temperament, it was insular, and Stenman was eager to share news of the burgeoning international art scene. An artist who would have a profound impact was El Greco. He was one of many historical masters to capture Schjerfbeck's attention, even if her exposure was limited to black and white illustrations in books. Spanish Woman, after El Greco, clearly pays explicit homage to El Greco's Madonnas, as do other paintings of later years. Writing in 1932 to her lifelong friend, the artist Helene Westermark, she spoke passionately about her attraction to the artist. In Toledo, quote, "In Toledo, to Greco, I still yearn as before, and they have explained this to me. People are drawn to their kindred spirits, and I have read about Greco that he paints the way aging painters do, without concerning himself with the results, but simply to express what he wanted to say." And then she adds, "What should we care for the results anymore? If in years to come someone should find our work on a scrap heap and see something in it, that's surely more than enough." In 1915, Stenman invited a handsome forester to visit Schjerfbeck in Hyvinka. Einar Reuter would profoundly impact Schjerfbeck in her lifetime, and ever afterwards for that matter. Their friendship grew intensively, fueled by a shared passion for art and literature. He collected her paintings, sent her books and French art magazines, and wrote her first biography. Above all else, Reuter was Schjerfbeck's confidant. 18 years her junior, she felt very deeply for him, ultimately writing nearly 1,000 letters to him over several decades. Since Swedish was her primary language, she was actually unable to read his Finnish language biography of her life and work. Long after she died, Reuter's biography was republished in Swedish. It actually may have been fortuitous that Schjerfbeck was spared Reuter's biography, for while he championed her art and clearly felt great affection for her, Reuter was the first to write of Schjerfbeck's cascading misfortunes. He mythologized her victimhood, exposing her fragile mental health, her low self-esteem, and struggle through life to develop her art to satisfaction. This undeserved legacy is slowly fading today as international audiences come to recognize her strengths, tenacity, and indomitable will. Exhibitions in European museums are multiplying. Schjerfbeck painted Einar Reuter on several occasions, here in formal dress and again in a sensual pose. She labored over the formal portrait, never quite satisfied. In the end, she just dismissed it as a sketch. The sailor is another matter. Awkward and seemingly unfinished, it was painted in 1918 when Helene and Einar spent 2 weeks together in Tamasari, a coastal village on the southern tip of Finland overlooking the Baltic. Suspending the expectation of formal elements, the viewer must read the painting as an elegy to Einar. Each brushstroke carried emotional weight. It was really a love poem. Helene had fun with her titles, often assigning misidentifications to her subjects. Reuter was no sailor. While teaching at the Finnish Art Society, Schjerfbeck was commissioned to travel to St. Petersburg, Vienna, and Florence to copy the great masters in their respective museums. She deftly painted the transcriptions of Dutch 17th century artists, as well as the magisterial Velasquez, among many others. The Finnish Art Society's historical collection was nascent, and this plan to show copies of masterpieces from Europe's premier museums seemed a suitable short-term solution to their empty walls. Today, these paintings reside in the Atheneum, Finland's national museum in Helsinki. While in Florence, copying the frescoes of Fra Filippo Lippi and Fra Angelico, Schjerfbeck painted several dreamy views of Fiesole, the hill town overlooking the city. Especially in the 1894 picture entitled Cypresses, trees dissolve into weightless masses. Even the cypresses lose clarity in their statuesque formation. The artist is already loosening her brushwork, puzzling the eye, and leaving the precision of her French training behind. Fragment, the profile study of a young redheaded girl who modeled for several pictures in Hyvinka, is exemplary of the artist's growing fascination with her materials. Resembling a fragment of a deteriorated plaster surface, the painting achieves a quiet pathos reminiscent of Renaissance Madonnas. Schjerfbeck used a palette knife to scrape away medium, Mimicking a passage of fresco worn over time, she wrote to Einar of her frustrations, quote, "The red-haired girl got so greasy and shiny from being overpainted so many times, I wanted to scrape it all off, but then I didn't have the nerve. I wanted to bury her in the ground to get rid of the shine, but I hadn't the nerve to do that either. I had no idea what the result would be, and I didn't dare paint on the background. It was better for it to stay that way. Cowardliness, fragment," end quote. Years later, Schjerfbeck searched for this piece to buy it back. She called it her most sensitive painting. The delicately crafted head set against the irregular textured background is indeed very affecting. As with the evolving aesthetic in figure painting, still life subjects run the gamut from pleasing impressionistic studies of flowers to arrangements of fruit that lose all sense of volume and geometry. Schjerfbeck painted the still life of apples and a vase of hydrangea entitled "The Red Apples" one winter in Hyvinka. The sharpened light and high-keyed color emerge from reflections in the snow outside. Structurally, the artist is abstracting geometries, softening form, and merging objects in a haze of light. She is clearly experimenting with surface textures in this pulsating picture. Using both a palette knife and brush, she varies the layers of paint and leaves passages roughly brushed as if to remind the viewer of her process. She once said of painting apples, "They are too beautiful to make a successful oil painting." Still life with blackening apples carries more weight than meets the eye. It was probably painted in Stockholm when Schjerfbeck moved where she moved reluctantly in 1944 at the urging of her dealer, Gösta Stenman. Stenman feared for her safety in Finland as war raged on. In a palette varying from off-white to black, the painted apples devolve into anonymous interlocking shapes, having no volume nor visual affinity with their fruit. Once again, Schjerfbeck has manipulated her surfaces, using dry pigment in varying degrees of application. The blackened apple is thought to be a metaphor for the devastation of war. The apple actually rotted while being painted, a further metaphor for the artist's own inexorable decline. She died 2 years later. If there is any through line in Schjerfbeck's remarkable career, it is her 40 self-portraits. From the youthful vigor of her early days to her growing confidence as a painter and increasing manipulation of her materials, to the final head studies, skeletons awaiting death. This corpus of material traces the artist's trajectory as an aging woman and evolving artist. We have 13 self-portraits in the exhibition. Many of the later self-portraits are still in private hands, passed from one generation to another with enduring reverence. The detailed chronology in our exhibition catalog demonstrates how consistently and widely Schjerfbeck's work was exhibited in the later decades of her life, building a lasting legacy in Nordic countries. Seeing Silence, our exhibition, is the first to show her work in the United States. It is on view until April 5th. Looking intently at the viewer and herself in a mirror, the young artist is on the cusp of life's adventures and tragedies in this early self-portrait. Loosely brushed in naturalistic language, Schjerfbeck neutralizes her background and lightly touched bodice in gray-brown tones while offering a sensitive self-awareness and youthful optimism in expression. She was living and studying in Paris when she painted this charming portrait. She has clearly mastered her intensive training. This portrait declares a self-image of increasing self-possession. It is prominently signed and dated. Schjerfbeck appears as if caught unaware, looking leftward with vibrant eyes, her very pale, chalky white face, interrupted by dashes of gray or rose red, presents against a flat black torso and variegated background of sheer abstraction. 50 years old, the artist is now experimenting with image and color, favoring aesthetic expression over tradition-bound verisimilitude. The asymmetry of the eyes, one blackened iris and the other translucent blue, adds another idiosyncratic touch. Fellow Finnish artist Helene Westermark, Schjerfbeck's great friend, called the painting technique ruthless. In 1914, Schjerfbeck was commissioned to paint a self-portrait for the boardroom of the Finnish Art Society. It was a distinct honor, for she was the only woman invited, along with 14 prominent male artists. One of Schjerfbeck's most celebrated paintings is the only self-portrait to interrupt the spare figure-ground relationship, here with a discreet paintbrush and red-rimmed tub. The signature above her head, evoking a gravestone epitaph, has led to the inference of mortality, but it's more like a self-conscious device to declare her presence in the company of men lining the same walls. Referencing this painting, Schjerfbeck wrote tellingly of her process, "I scrape out everything I have done, for it's not what I want, and when I've scraped many times, what remains on the canvas is a hint of all I have sought for and wanted, even if it's only a weak trace, or else there is nothing. The result is the sum total of my search. That is how I always work." Schjerfbeck's increasingly stylized image reaches a climax in self-portrait with silver background. The rather formal handling is less a study of self than an investigation of materials, pencil, watercolor, and charcoal in combination with silver leaf. At face value, the iridescent silver leaf reflects the mirror from which the artist captured her image. Her kimono-like garment, barely defined in charcoal, pencil, and watercolor, situates the viewer relative to the mirror. We see the raised sleeve of her working arm. As with so many of Schjerfbeck's self-portraits, she gives few clues to her inner self. Her cool detachment and rather stiff definition are only interrupted by vibrant eyes that lock in the viewer with bemused intensity. Quote, "I have drawn from the mirror a melancholy eye in a large dark shadow," end quote. Schjerfbeck's words seem to describe this abandoned self-portrait. Of course, it is the aggressive scratches incising the face that draw our attention. Was the artist expressing frustration or simply canceling the portrait? Whatever the motivation, she reversed the canvas and painted factory girls on the way to work, an image framed and shown on the walls of a Finnish museum for decades. It was only recently that the scratched canvas on the reverse was discovered. Of course, there is an irony to her scratches, since scratching through layers of paint was customary in her practice and central to her painting process for much of her life. An angular jaw, almond eyes, pursed lips, and mask-like head pushing against the picture plane characterize self-portrait in black. She is 73 years old. The high-collared black dress carries no volume, only a dab of olive green paint, likely a brooch, centers the upper chest. Her facial distortions, seen increasingly in the late self-portraits, are at once disarming and arresting. She has found her tropes of self-expression. Faced with the ongoing devastations of the Second World War, Gösta Stemmen persuaded Schjerfbeck to leave Finland for a safer environment. She spent her last years in Stockholm, yearning to return to her beloved country. It was there that she painted 20 of the now legendary self-portraits. They are among the most extraordinary portraits in modern times, and the market for them has never waned. In many of these, she worked in thin glazes of color, paint that soaked into the canvas as if a metaphor for the gradual dissolution of self toward death. Schjerfbeck has lost all facial idiosyncrasy. She is herself in paint, and at the same time, anyone on the eve of death. When I first saw this painting in storage at the National Museum in Helsinki, the Athenaeum, it took my breath away. Raw and cadaverous, her black, socketed left eye is stunning, while the right side of her face loses all definition in deep shadow. The face of death, I wonder what the artist meant by the red dot. For someone who cherished her privacy in life, she painted pending death with raw candor. This image, painted a year before Schjerfbeck died, has been called her most brutal self-portrait. Instead of focusing on death and bodily deterioration, the skeletal face is metaphoric of anger. There is no resemblance to its human. The mouth and eyes are black sockets, the nose and single nostril mere strokes of the brush. Schjerfbeck's working of the canvas is equally as brutal, even if this technique characterizes many of the artist's more peaceful paintings. As per the title, Schjerfbeck is structuring her face of death, what's left of it, in light and shadow. Only the proper left side of her face has definition. The unusual palette, taken from the green tiles of her hotel bathroom in Stockholm, in no way diminishes the force of the ghost-like head. Imagine that Schjerfbeck was in her 80s when she executed these extraordinary portraits. Schjerfbeck wrote to her dear friend Einar Reuter in November 1945, quote, "I have no strength left. Life has given me all it has to give," end quote. This resignation is captured in Schjerfbeck's final self-portrait in oil, her last painting in life. With features articulated, strangely manipulated ears, and a vacant expression, the artist truly has no strength left, a face stilled and near death. Helene Schjerfbeck died of cancer on January 23, 1946, with her easel at her side, having drawn her last self-portrait in charcoal only days earlier. Her ashes were brought back to Finland for burial. Laying flowers at her graveside, Einar Reuter said the following words, quote, "You have now reached great peace. Your days were heavy, days and nights, during the long years and decades, heavy from loneliness. Only the brief moments of being able to create did that heavy path brighten for you. In those moments when you felt you were able to bring to reality something of the vision you see in your mind's eye, the people of Finland thank you for that brightest beauty you have given us." And I thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you. On July 27th, 1920, Helene Schjerfbeck wrote to her close friend and biographer, Einar Reuter, "Now I want to paint my painting. It is, of course, the Mademoiselle in a black lace shawl with flowers." This is the first time that Schjerfbeck mentioned the painting that was to occupy her energies well into the fall of that year. The next day she wrote, "I want to paint a harsh painting with a strong expression." She was spending the summer in the coastal town of Temisaari, southwest of Helsinki, as she had done the previous 2 years. Her model, the Mademoiselle, was a local named Sigrid Nyberg, pictured here in what is likely the dress uniform of the weaving school that she attended from 1907 to 12. Nyberg, the daughter of a sea captain, lived close to the fish market and had 3 apartments for rent. Schjerfbeck was one of her tenants, and the two became friends. That same summer, Nyberg also posed for this picture. When the museum acquired the lace shawl in 2023, it was the first painting by the artist to enter a museum collection in the United States. As I undertook the examination and conservation treatment, I became fascinated by the degree to which Schjerfbeck's materials and her unusual process contribute to the painting's overall impact. Together with Sylvia Centeno, my colleague in the Department of Scientific Research here at the Met, we took a deep dive into her technique. And it led to a trip to Helsinki, where, thanks to generous colleagues, I got to study many of her paintings and found her creative process and its role in her work all the more compelling. Schjerfbeck's singular artistic vision was built on the firm foundation of many years of training, first in Helsinki and then in Paris, where she arrived in 1880, aged 18. Her paintings from this time reflect the French naturalism of the day, but even in these early works, we get a sense of her developing a modernist aesthetic. During the 1880s and 90s in Paris and beyond, she took every opportunity to see and absorb art, both contemporary, and here I'm showing a work by Jules Bastien-Lepage, an artist whom she admired greatly, and art of the past, including this great Titian in the Louvre. In her copies of paintings in European collections commissioned by the Finnish state, it's striking how she captured not only the technique of these very different artists, but also the sensibility of their work. She was particularly drawn to Renaissance frescoes, first encountering the Botticelli on the left at the Louvre, and later, on a trip to Florence, she was deeply moved by Fra Angelico's frescoes in the convent of San Marco. She later wrote, "I paint because I've seen paintings that make me happy. Some inner force pushes me to strive towards creating something similar, and I hold out hope every time." The first 2 decades of the 20th century were a period of tremendous growth in her work, which took place in the isolation of Hyvinka and Tamisaari, but fueled by what she'd experienced and encountered on her travels. Using her mother and neighbors as models, she progressively pared down her subjects to their essential forms, lines, and colors, and with a new focus on surface and texture. Foundational to this was her choice of canvas support. In early paintings like Mother and Child from 1887, her medium weight, industrially woven canvases had little impact on the appearance of the work. In the 1900s, Schjerfbeck began to see the potential of canvas for textural and pictorial effects she was seeking, and to select her canvases carefully for each composition, some coarser, some finer. For the lace shawl, she chose a coarse, fibrous, markedly slubby canvas. Here's the same area flipped around. As viewers were immediately aware of the canvas texture due to her mostly thin applications of ground and paint, especially as revealed when, as part of her creative process, she scraped through layers of paint, exposing the high points of the weave. More on that momentarily. Schjerfbeck prepared her canvas with a white ground that she applied herself. Here you can see spots where it seeped through the back of the canvas. The ground, a mixture of chalk and animal glue, was highly absorbent, wicking away oil from the overlying paint, producing a matte, plastery surface. In this detail of her 1912 self-portrait, taken in a slightly raking light, we can see how much a matte surface brings to the luminosity and vibrancy of her painting. Like artists of the avant-garde whose work she would have encountered in Paris, her dry, unvarnished surfaces were a deliberate upending of the norms of traditional academic painting that called for a slick, varnished finish. A particularly significant figure in this respect was the artist Pierre Puvis de Chavannes. Schjerfbeck would have known his work, including this painting, The Poor Fisherman, shown at the Paris Salon of 1881, and she may even have received some instruction from him when at the Académie Colarossi. Puvis' fresco-like surfaces, close tones, and dreamlike aesthetics seem to have struck a particular chord with her, one that resonated with her response to Renaissance frescoes. As Dita has noted, another aspect of these works that she found compelling was their aged, weathered surfaces and areas of loss. In her haunting painting Fragment, made in 1904, she radically scraped her paint in a way that evokes aged and fragmentary frescoes, at the same time conveying a distinctly modern sense of process and lack of finish. Sgraffito, where a paint layer is selectively scraped away to reveal what lies below, has a long history in the fine and decorative arts. Here's an example from the Met's collection by the Italian late Gothic painter Pietro di Domenico. To create the pattern of the cloth on which the Madonna is seated, the red egg tempera paint was selectively scraped away to reveal the gold leaf below, and the gold subsequently embellished with a tool that made little indentations. In Paris, Schjerfbeck would have seen works featuring rubbed and scraped paint by artists like Morisot and Degas. Like matte surfaces, The visible sense of process in paintings like these signaled modernity and a rejection of the academic mainstream's notions of finish, which required the labor of painting to appear effortless and invisible. Exemplified by this artist, Adolf William Bouguereau, seen here in a detail of a painting made the same year as the Degas on the right. We see Schjerfbeck using scraping and rubbing in her underlayers in works like By the Cradle from 1893, here in the background. In the Semstras, painted in 1905, she played off areas of broad scraping, as here in the shadows of the face, diffusing its contours and denoting an ethereal quality, with sharply delineated lines incised into the paint, made with the assistance of a straight edge for contours of the scissors and the rocking chair. Increasingly, Schjerfbeck conceived her pictures in terms of paint layers that she would manipulate mechanically by strategic rubbing, scraping with a flat blade, and scratching with a stylus, before adding more layers that might cover the abraded points and fill the fine channels. This additive and subtractive process would continue until she'd realized the effects she sought. In these details from paintings in the show, you can see how materiality and a sense of process became bound to her artistry. In a letter written as she embarked on the lace shawl, she wrote, "That which is completed is dead." So how did she go about creating this painting? Anticipating her manipulation of the paint, rather than stretching the canvas on a stretcher, as was conventional, she would have pinned it to a board, providing a hard surface against which to scrape. With the canvas prepared and Nyberg posing in front of her, a black lace shawl around her shoulders, she brushed in key contours of the composition with carbon-based black lines of varying thickness, and then she began painting. Schjerfbeck's applications and manipulations were highly strategic, and they vary according to the area depicted. In the shawl, she began with a thin, dark red underpainting, a subtle mixture of 4 pigments: vermilion, a translucent red lake likely derived from madder, Prussian blue, and a carbon-based black. Once it was dry, she used a broad, flat blade, like a palette knife, to scrape vigorously through this paint layer, exposing the high points of the ground and canvas weave beneath, and a pointed stylus to scratch fine channels. Next, she brushed on dilute carbon-based black paint that filled these channels and covered the scraped high points, creating a lacy effect. The photomicrograph on the right shows an area that's a little under a square inch of the painting. On the left side of the figure, she added pearly gray paint made with zinc white, later abrading that layer too, so that only traces of it remain. Then, using wide brushes and more dilute black paint, she added the lapel-like areas of the shawl, where the fabric is doubled over, using 2 layers for the deepest blacks. In the head, Schjerfbeck scraped and scratched into her white ground prior to applying paint, so that when she underpainted Nyberg's features with bone black, the paint was absorbed preferentially into the roughened high points of the canvas weave. You can see this as what appear as black dots under the deep pink of the mouth. She painted Nyberg's flesh with a range of pale green brushstrokes, zinc white tinted with a little Prussian blue, and Indian yellow, a translucent yellow lake, adding a little madder red lake for the cheek. Once it was dry, she scratched into the paint of the chin. These marks, which run parallel to the contour of the chin as well as perpendicular to it, are virtually imperceptible to the naked eye. Ironically, effects that she sought had been suppressed in a previous restoration. Here's the painting before the recent conservation treatment. It looks darker because the paint was saturated with a glossy varnish, antithetical to the dry, fresco-like surface she'd created. And some of the paint she'd deliberately abraded had been retouched. On the right is the painting after treatment, returned to the matte surface and scraped paint that she intended. Most of Schjerfbeck's paintings involve similarly complex applications and manipulations, but the extent of her work on the lace shawl does appear to be exceptional. We get some insight into the evolution of the painting thanks to letters written to Reuter and to technical imaging that allows us to see compositional elements she later changed. Macro X-ray fluorescence uses a fine X-ray beam that scans across the painting, producing distribution maps of chemical elements. And from these maps, we can infer what pigments are present. In this X-ray fluorescence distribution map for iron, we can image all the places she used the pigment Prussian blue, ferric ferrocyanide. The Prussian blue component of her deep red underpaint for the lace shawl reveals that initially, Nyberg's shoulders were more clearly delineated, and the shawl was wrapped across her chest, creating a deep V. Surface examination shows that this area was particularly heavily worked. On August 31st, Schjerfbeck wrote to Reuter about her struggles with the painting, including the impact of wildfires in Karelia to the east, which altered the light. Just over a week later, I paint little. Everything turns out to flat surfaces in Mademoiselle's portrait. Black and exaggerated cold green. Too furious, big. I want to do it differently, but cannot. Later in September, she wrote that she'd removed a squared pattern on the shawl, sensing that simpler was better. This is so intriguing. Sadly, we have no way of imaging this earlier design. Her final touches were boldly brushed green, blue, black, and cream strokes in the neck and shoulder that seemed to float over the matte, braided paint beneath. As Schjerfbeck pared down her pictorial language, she relied increasingly on such contrasts. Glossy or medium rich over matte, thick impasto over thin washes, and heavily worked passages versus unpainted ground. Her spectral self-portrait, made a year before her death, is painted entirely in shades of green on a white ground, and a large part of the work's mesmerizing presence derives from its dynamic, varied handling, where passages applied and manipulated with a palette knife play against strokes made with a brush and lines of charcoal or black chalk. The palette that she used for the lace shawl presages her more monochromatic works in an interesting way. Though the range of colors looks quite broad, Schjerfbeck used a rather small number of pigments in this painting. Prussian blue, in particular, features in mixtures throughout the painting, contributing to a carefully calibrated harmony overall. The flesh, background, and green area in the neck are all made from the same three pigments: Prussian blue, zinc white, and Indian yellow, but in different ratios. And Prussian blue and Indian yellow were also mixed with Madder Red Lake for the deep pink of the mouth. Her final work on the lace shawl was to mount the painting on a stretcher. As I noted earlier, it was her practice to pin her canvas to a board while she worked. When the picture was nearing completion, she would decide on its format and make marks indicating where her canvas should be folded back over a stretcher. The mark she made along the left edge is precisely where she folded it back. But at the bottom, she made one line and then another, and finally ignored both, stretching the painting in an elongated format that emphasizes the length of Nyberg's face and the lace shawl. In this view of the bottom edge, we can see how the larger composition continues on what are now the tacking margins. Her open-ended sense of composition and leaving her demarcation lines visible, as she did in multiple pictures, are further aspects of her embrace of process as integral to her work. Thank you very much.
Hello. Well, I have to say that I'm so grateful to be included in this conversation. Dita Amory has helped us to see Schjerfbeck in the fullness of her career, and Charlotte Hale has just offered us the opportunity to see in minute detail the strategies that Schjerfbeck used in constructing her paintings. I'm interested in what we cannot see, or rather, what we cannot fully know by looking. Whoops. Among the many things that enthralled me when I first encountered Schjerfbeck's painting in the 1980s was their integrity, their sense of ambiguity, their capacity to trap our interests and thwart our interpretive surety. And for me, the tapestry is a painting that opens up all of this kind of push-pull, this quality of interpretive indeterminacy in her work. And I'd like to begin with a very close reading of the painting. In the tapestry, two gracefully elongated and stylishly clad people stand in a nearly square canvas, dividing it in three and anchoring the scene. Their contours echo one another in that the jacket worn by the male figure kind of tilts to the left at the upper arm and swells toward the right at the stomach and then departs again to the left in the peculiar stance of those stylized dandyish legs. And the silhouette of the woman in her opalescent dress is staged in reverse, pulling subtly out where his compresses, pushing inward where his expands, such that the space between them is quietly magnetized by the echoing forms. Where they stand in relation to one another is ambiguous, but as the man's feet are slightly cropped by the canvas edge and hers are not, perhaps he's located in slightly closer proximity to us, the beholders. The combination of techniques used to depict the woman, the notable contour lines that mark the edges of her dress, which are in places eroded and dissolved into the scumbled white paint, creates a kind of aura around the figure, as though she's luminous or erratic, or that we see her through a scrim. So the figures seem to exist in two different registers of creation, one much more articulated and one sort of dissolving. In preparatory sketches, the colors assigned to the model's clothing is less stark, less luminous. The decision to amp up the silhouette of the male figure by darkening the clothing and to render the woman in ice blue painted over the palest of pink against a muted turquoise backdrop makes her almost wraith-like and him more immediately palpable, as though the linear presence of his upper body gives way to the curious erasure of his lower legs, as though he himself has become pure textile. The coral-colored chair with the exaggerated legs cropped at the right side seems to support a black hat echoing the man's dark suit. But even here, the location of that hat is ambiguous, I get worried about it, because it looks at once like it's about to slide off the top of the chair, but it also seems, in its precarity, potentially to be painted onto the backdrop behind the chair. As in many of her inventions, Schjerfbeck thwarts our expectation of understanding through a few other details that shift our perception. One is, of course, the woman's shadow, cast onto what is at first seeming like an open view of nature, but which we recognize as marking the shallow space between her body and a wall, which we are, or may be, beholding the tapestry of the painting's title. Schjerfbeck emphasized that shadow by subtly doubling it as it extends from the woman's fashionable feet across the floor onto the wall, where it becomes much more solid than she herself appears. The shadows cast by the figures are depicted also at different angles. The chair to the right barely casts a shadow at all. So where are they all? Where are we in looking at them? Obviously, the biggest of the ambiguities here is the title that directs us to query the status of the relationship between the two figures and the landscape in the backdrop. The spindly trees, the purple island, the sea, and the sky. In structure, and perhaps in its suggestion of reverie before nature, the painting may have loose alliances with the Swedish artist and theoretician Richard Batty, whose Nordic Summer Evening of 1899 to 1900 likewise places two figures before a landscape. Art historian Michel Fakos notes the models, singer Karin Peek on the left and Sweden's Prince Eugen on the right, are suspended in a moment in which human and the environment are in a mutual stasis, united, she writes, in the great space of nature, a kind of Nordic national ethos. That formula was also explored by Edvard Munch, whose figures in the print, two human beings, the lonely ones, both gaze away from us and into the evening landscape, as though the environment is the very vehicle of their connection. And what I suggest here is neither that the Batty canvas or Munch's print were directly related to Schjerfbeck's canvas, but they are among the many images of figures in reverie before nature that invokes the kind of expectation that we would have of such a landscape formula, a romantic conceit familiar throughout the 19th century, and which I reference here by citing Caspar David Friedrich, and alluding to the Metropolitan Museum's exhibition of his work last year. And it's that expectation of formulaic reverie that Schjerfbeck invokes only to undermine, because this is instead the representation of a work of artifice, seemingly of a mural-sized tapestry representing a highly distilled landscape. The male figure seems to gaze at the artificial vista and holds his hands behind his back in a manner of a connoisseur. Or is he in conversation or mutual regard with the woman whose gaze wanders away from him and wanders away from us and just seems to look out at nothing? We cannot know him but for the posture, the dark suit, the legs that disappear into the canvas weave, and the red lines signifying his ears seen from behind. The artist adjusted the composition by adding canvas amendments to the top and to the bottom, moving us further away from the figures in question, as in the image on the left, and creating that ambiguity about where the man's ghostly feet are stationed, where the shadows reside, and how we can begin to locate ourselves in relation to the figures. So I'd now like to discuss the tapestry in the painting, or the painting maybe as a tapestry, as Einar Reuter recalled Schjerfbeck contemplating such a large canvas as, quote, a big rug on the wall. Following a period of illness and depression at the turn of the 20th century, Schjerfbeck composed patterns for wall hangings, tablecloths, and cushions for the Friends of Finnish Handicrafts as a means of financial support. That organization, founded in 1879 by artist Fanny Schjerfbeck, was concerned that foreign industrial goods would eclipse Finland's national material identity. And on the screen, I'm showing you the organization's logo, the Friends of Finnish Handicraft, and a standard label attached to every design, this one by the architect Eliel Saarinen, as well as an embroidery pattern by Schjerfbeck. The Friends of Finnish Handicraft therefore gave both an economic outlet to women and men in the arts, and also invested in their work a special significance in that women, as Fanny Schjerfbeck claimed, created the nation's material cultural identity, and I quote her in the founding of this organization. While the men were singing the Kalevala's ancient verse and reflecting his thoughts in bright poetry, she wrote, his wife wove heavenly arcs of colored weaving and crafted patterns from her own imagination to adorn herself in her poor home. Thus, she unwittingly created the basis of the domestic foundation for our taste, end of quotes. The Friends of Finnish Handicraft popularized textile production, offered lessons in the fiber arts, and produced completed works for sale and patterns for others to follow. The Friends of Finnish Handicraft entered the world stage at the Universal Exposition of 1900, when, in the Finnish National Pavilion in Paris, Akseli Gallen-Kallela exhibited his flame rug, under the aegis of the Friends, helping to set off an international appetite for Finnish Ria rugs. According to art historian Leena Ottola-Morehouse, the Friends of Finnish Handicraft purchased Schjerfbeck's designs between about 1902 and 1910, and Schjerfbeck exhibited with the organization annually from 1908 to 1912. Exploring surface patterning, extracting both motifs, and extrapolating ideas from Japanese material culture, she, like Galen Kalala, produced traditional techniques such as ria, embroidery, and applique in a modern vocabulary. Schjerfbeck produced her birch design, which you see on the right, both as an original textile and also as a pattern to be followed, along with her instructions for its manufacturing techniques. She exhibited the dance, which you see at the left, at the autumn exhibition of Friends of Finnish Handicrafts in 1911, which included those abstracted tree trunks and abstracted crowns, which we also see in the tapestry. Schjerfbeck's paintings of her mother, her friends, and neighbors concentratedly working on textile arts testifies both to the larger arena of women's production in the 19th century, embroidery, knitting, lacework, sewing, repair work, which is both intimate and domestic, but also which held particular resonance for nation building in Finland in that period. In their reduced surface patterning and muted palette, Schjerfbeck's textiles and her paintings were in close dialogue throughout this period. The ambiguities and in-betweenness of the textile, what are we seeing, who are we seeing, where are we located, where are they located, throw me into a pleasant state of confusion, or aporia. Aporia is the condition in which mutually contradictory information establishes a place of not knowing, of unresolvable disorientation. Schjerfbeck's experimental use of media, which we just heard about, often resulted in blurred, smeared, nearly achromatic images, pictures that seem to offer one way of seeing, but then hands us another. They're both figurative, and yet they're self-erasing in some way. They operate in this realm of aporia. Her figurative works are, on one level, discernible by subject and object, yet viewing them with the same sort of intense care which she exercised in her ideas and her techniques reveals layers of creative misregistrations and refusals of knowability. And as we learn from Dita Amory and her co-creator, and also Anna Maria von Bonsdorf, in the 1890s, Schjerfbeck began to search for simplification and clarity of form by emphasizing contours and silhouettes and tamping down the color. Von Bonsdorf identifies this palette, explored throughout the generation of artists practicing at the 1890s, as color ascetism, the reduction of palette toward gray, a nuancing of color and generalization of form that serves as a distancing device. The works of Pierre Puvis de Chavannes were important models in this process of optical compression for Schjerfbeck's entire generation of Nordic artists that traveled to Paris, for whom the artist's new murals at the Sorbonne, unveiled in 1889, served as a kind of gallery of inspiration. And as we just heard, Schjerfbeck encountered Puvis' work in the early 1880s, where he served as one of the instructors of Schjerfbeck's painter's sisters, and where she might have met him. She expressed lifelong admiration for his work, even according to her friend and supporter Einar Reuter. She kept a reproduction of The Poor Fisherman close at hand. The nuanced colors and blur effect that Schjerfbeck explored into the 19-teens in works like The Schoolgirl have also been likened to the tight tonalities and chiaroscuro effects of James McNeill Whistler and Eugène Carrière, as observed by a critic in Schjerfbeck's 1914 exhibition. The artists had a shared, quote, intensity of atmosphere and not color. Her work is often likened to the production of Danish artist Wilhelm Hammershøi. While Schjerfbeck knew these bodies of work, she rejected the idea that her paintings, with their veiled, indistinct contours, reduced palette, and lack of narrative specificity, derived from those of Hammershøi. She was insistent that she did not copy other artists' works, but probed them in a kind of creative partnership. Schjerfbeck continually endeavored to experiment with such effects, writing repeatedly about her search for an aesthetic of suggestion and nuance to her lifelong sister painter, and in her younger years, her frequent studio mate, Maria Wieck, who at times shared her reduced form and color. In 1894, Schjerfbeck wrote to Wieck about her admiration of matte black and white photographs of paintings by the British artist and designer Edward Burne-Jones. Quote, "Everything is in the lines and expression. Perhaps the colors would only disturb me if one saw the paintings," end of quote. In 1911, she explained in a letter to Wieck that the Impressionist paintings she'd seen in Paris had left her cold. She'd found the colors disturbing and too monotonous. About a decade and a half later, she queried of Wieck, "Did you know that Degas washed his pastels and bleached them in the sun to get that dead tone, which yields such fabulous color? I too must kill the tone before it acquires strength. Pure color is nothing but raw and weak to me." She worked fiercely to achieve the balance between something that seems drained of color and at the same time intensely chromatically nuanced. A self-portrait from 1932 suggests a delightful hide and seek in terms of her practice. Her self-image, clothing, and background are muted and sort of headed toward monochrome, but what appears to be her palette, proffered at the bottom of the composition, holds bright blue, white, yellow, and at the very far right, a dot of red paint, which speaks of the process of rendering neutral tones from the brightest of colors. To that end, I'm showing you one of Wilhelm Hammershøi's palettes, which is encrusted with layers of smoky and oyster-colored paint, and with that yellow daub that you see toward the left, which speaks of his process of mixing complementary colors, as pictured here in Michel-Eugène Chevreul's color wheel of the 1860s, painting and toning and toning and toning the resultant mixture with white to bring down the chroma. The tight nuancing of color, bordering on but never neutral, never a consistent gray, requires both the careful progressive color canceling by the hand of the artist and demands of the viewer a close engagement and commitment to recognize the tiny revelations of gray, which is actually pink, mauve, lavender, ochre, and so on. Pure color, Schjerfbeck wrote to another of her sister painters in the 1930s, pure colors are false. There's no such thing in nature as pure color, except in the rainbow, which is not beautiful. In the 1880s, Schjerfbeck began to explore a synthesizing effect in her work, even in her more sort of shiny Parisian-like paintings. Her commissioned work as a copyist had brought her before Botticelli's Tornabuoni frescoes, newly rediscovered and transported to the Louvre in Paris. There, in 1882, she began to study the tonal and surface structure of fresco painting. As she often reported, the close study of old masters offered her the intimate opportunity to learn their techniques and then digest and adapt them very specifically to her tastes and her vision. Her time in Florence, in Fiesole in 1894, was particularly generative for her, as we've just heard, as she recalled starting to simplify form and adopt a subdued palette due to her study of fresco. There, both rendering copies after Fra Angelico in the convent of San Marco. She also traveled to Fiesole, which we've heard a moment ago, with fellow Finnish painter Ellen Teslev, where she explored delicately muted landscape views in a shared vocabulary of synthetic reduction with her travel partner. At the time, Teslev also explored a softened, generalizing approach to painting, as testified here on the left-hand side of the screen in this Finnish landscape painting from the same year. And of course, Schjerfbeck's enigmatic fragment, with its abraded surface, generalized form, and exquisitely nuanced palette, is an exceptionally resonant extraction of the aged surfaces, physical losses, and mystical subjects of the sacred frescoes that had so captivated and inspired her. Schjerfbeck had begun a path toward her ascetic vocabulary and her suppression of both detail and narrative, even in her early landscape views. Her 1883 painting, Shadow on the Wall, which she considered one of her most successful works, manifestly represents a bench nestled against a massive granite boulder and some trees. The title, however, redirects our focus to the dark violet tinged shadow that snakes across the rocks, seemingly cast by a tree that's cropped at the right edge of the painting. The painting is more about, therefore, the absence of light and form than the material objects depicted. Its shadow probes the perception of invisibility. Suppressing local detail, and establishing a harmonious color key, as well as constructing a composition around the eccentric pathway of a shadow, she was, even in the 1880s, meticulously exploring the ways in which the emotional resonance of place affects perception. Her inventive adaptation of fresco-like tonalism, reduced form, and unexpected compositional foci expanded throughout her practice, including this landscape on the right from 1914. Now, the French poet Stéphane Mallarmé identified a central tenet of symbolist poetry in the 1880s when he wrote, quote, "To name an object is to suppress 3/4 of the enjoyment to be found in a poem. Suggestion, that is the dream," end of quote. To occlude detail and not provide it, to turn subjects away from the viewer's gaze, to reject the bright colors and sparkling finish of oil paint can provide, that oil paint can provide, but instead to abrade her surfaces and dry them out, were all procedural strategies to, in Mallarmé's terms, suggest and not define. And in Schjerfbeck's words, it's by a mere hint that we seek the truth. For me, this is one of the achievements of Schjerfbeck, to throw her viewer into this state of aporia, of not knowing, of living with hints and not with answers. Mallarmé's poetry of suggestion was shared by Schjerfbeck, Hammershøi, and Tetzlaff, and also contributed to the practice of pictorialist photography in the period. In a shared aesthetic with painters seeking synthesis and suggestibility, practitioners such as Robert Demaquis in France, Alfred Niebaum in Finland, and Fred Holland Day in the US explored the potential to place the camera and printmaking and photographic printing in the service of emotion and individual expression rather than clear depiction. Exploring uncorrected and softening lenses or textured papers and media such as carbon or gum bichromate that created softened tonal effects, they often emulated the optical properties of Impressionist and Symbolist art. Day was among pictorialism's greatest champions through his membership of Britain's Brotherhood of the Linked Ring and exhibitions he helped to organize in the United States, London, and Paris that featured this approach to aesthetics. And these exhibitions were both well-known and objects of immense debate in the art press as well as photographic press. Day wrote of pictorialist practitioners, quote, "These artists have sought no longer detail but ensemble. They've found that the indefinite is the road to the infinite. They satisfy that delicious uncertainty of the soul, where all is promised and nothing is given." He and his pictorialist companions undermined the expectation of the camera eye, in which painting or a photograph or any medium can offer us the opportunity to not know what we're seeing. To conclude by returning to the tapestry with its muted tones, its softened contours, its abraded surface, and to borrow Day's term, delicious uncertainty, the final thing I wish to consider is Schjerfbeck's deployment of this kind of unknowing and unseeing that's sort of built into her ways of working. To create an optical state of subtle indeterminacy by eroding or partly occluding an image is to establish a circuit of expectation and desire. We want to see what we expect to see, a story, a figure, an expectation that we hold, but we're often then met with silence or the opposite of what we expect. Max Hollein writes in the Met Catalog, "There's something holding you at arm's length. Your gaze and your empathic psyche want to come closer." Schjerfbeck's practice of forsaking narrative in lieu of atmosphere, and particularly her choice to picture her sitters as turned away from the viewer, or looking askance, or with closed eyes, places them at the threshold of knowability. The turned away face, as in our male visitor with the red ears in the tapestry, the blurred resolution, the rubbed surfaces, the layers of paint ever so slightly out of register, are invitations for desire. We seek resolution in optical acuity, in knowing identity. The art historian Bridget Alsdorf, in writing about a similar practice in Hammershøi's work, allied such unknowability with Søren Kierkegaard's either-or, a determination to unsettle any sense of satisfaction or conviction. It's an opportunity to think. In psychoanalytic terms, the thing we're promised but we cannot know or cannot see is the thing we most want to know. The background that's both landscape and textile scape in this painting, the silhouetting and luminosity, the dissolution of that unknowable male into the canvas surface itself, that constructed difficulty of that wraith-like woman offer, for me, the greatest gift of not knowing, to be trapped by this extraordinary painter's ability to give and take, and this exhibition's richness of giving us each that structure of desire that brings us back again and again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll come back again and again to see the exhibition, and never forget Helene Schjerfbeck. Thank you.